looking at the first section of Julia Cassaniti's Living Buddhism. So, part one, emotion. Now, of the five sorts of anthropological focus that we open with, so economy, politics, beliefs and practices, aesthetics, and kinship, Cassaniti places less emphasis on politics and economy than on religion or beliefs and practices, and to a lesser extent, kinship and aesthetics, at least in this first section. Of the approaches that we've covered, materialist, interpretive, or symbolic anthropology, functionalism, and structuralism, it's not yet entirely clear that she favors any particular one of these, but there are a couple that we can rule out. So she does not appear to be taking a materialist or a political economic approach to understanding Buddhism, nor a structuralist approach. They just don't seem to capture the kinds of questions that she's asking. In the introduction, to get to that question, she writes, "I come to Majang because I was intrigued about how Buddhist ideas are lived in everyday life. Not inside a wat. A wat is a Buddhist temple. Not a Thai Buddhist temple, I should say. Not abstracted and isolated from the pressures and interests of day-to-day living, but as part of them. Religious life in Majang is more than just an engagement with formal Buddhism. It is about a range of emotional and behavioral practices that make up the cultural psychology of people in the community. They live Buddhism as part of the taken for granted way of being in the world." So this sounds, to my ear, closer to functionalist and interpretive interests, not identical with them. I think that there's a way that a certain kind of psychological anthropology is involved here as well. So that's a realm that we haven't covered. But for the most part, proponents of that model of anthropology draw more heavily on figures like Durkheim and therefore functionalism than they do on any other particular tradition within anthropology. But also, I think that she does a certain amount of interpretive work that at least bears an echo of the kind of work that we see with Geertz. But she doesn't make any explicit claims either way. So we have to turn to her text to see how it unfolds and to try and sort of capture the echo of these different schools of anthropology as the work progresses. So, chapter 1, Cool Hearts. In the opening sections of this chapter, Cassaniti outlines her fieldwork. So integrating into the community by accompanying people as they go about their everyday lives, participating in the chores and festivals, living with a family, all these sorts of things. The ways that she becomes, in a sense, a part of the community. So that's not to say becomes easily mistaken for a Thai person. I don't think that happens. But she becomes a part of the community in that her social life is organized around their lives, and to some extent their lives become organized around hers, so that they become mutually imbricated in one another's lives. But she doesn't just start right off the bat asking them about the topic that is her central interest, how Buddhism figures into their lives. Instead, what we see is that she spends time finding her feet, to take that phrase that Geertz borrowed from Wittgenstein, finding her feet with the village so that she can time her interviews well, she can select her interview participants carefully, she can prepare her questions properly, and that includes putting them in the relevant languages, because she interviews people who speak more than just Thai. She interviews also some Karen people as well, and so has to adapt her interview questions to those languages. We also see that she waits until she feels confident with the language before she undertakes interviews. But still, even before that point, even before she starts to interview, she's able to collect certain kinds of interesting information about people's everyday lives as she's learning the language. But almost right away, she runs into a problem. She's gone into the field with an idea of what she wants to examine, these sort of great events and emotional encounters, only to discover that these things are not on display. They're not the sort of staples of everyday life that she had perhaps anticipated that they would be. They're not readily visible, in other words. Instead, she finds something like the opposite. There's this pervasive call for Jayen, or cool heart. Jai meaning heart, and yen, cool. This is something that I also became very familiar with while I was in Thailand, that people would constantly admonish somebody who seemed to be getting excited about something or agitated about something. They'd say, Jayan, Jayan, like cool down, relax. And the corresponding part of this that's relevant for her work is that means sort of this reduction in affect, this reduction in expressiveness. So exactly the things, these displays of emotion that she was hoping to see, run counter to this dearly held value of maintaining a cool heart. We discover then one of the dangers of fieldwork here. If you go to the field with an expectation of what's going to be there, what you're going to find, you can run into problems when your expectations are mistaken. You don't discover the thing that you had expected to discover there. And then you have different kinds of problems that you can face. Either you start sort of hallucinating it when it's not there, trying to find it wherever you can, or hints of it wherever you can, or you discover that you've come with the wrong expectations and now you need to recalibrate your work to figure out what you are actually seeing. She takes more the latter path. I don't see her in the opening section of the book projecting the existence of things that she wants to find where they don't exist. Instead, what does she do? She makes adjustments. She drafts her interview questions in the light of what she actually finds there to learn about the role of religion in people's lives. Through her interviews and participation in village life, and that means attending weddings, going to the temple, just sort of whenever to the Wat whenever people feel the inclination to go there, attending the weekly sort of sermons that the abbot would give, things like this. She's participating then in the same things that the other people in the village participate in. As she's doing that, she starts to interpret Jayan and Buddhism with respect to one another. So rather than as this kind of cultural form and this religious set of practices and beliefs as these kind of separate things that have their own lives, she's starting to see them as knit into one another. And especially with respect to how Buddhism can help cultivate Jayan, right? Like how going to the temple, engaging in Buddhist practices like meditation or merit-making activities can help you cultivate Jayan. with this insight, the relationship between this central value, Jayen, and religious practice, she becomes attuned to the centrality of the Wat in community life. So then she notes that the role of the Wat is not only religious, but social as well. And indeed, this is something that that I saw when I was in rural Thailand, that the temple was where all the religious activities would take place, of course, but it's also where there was a school. It's where people would collect for religious or other festive days to, say, make floats for a particular festival called Le Creton. These floats that were supposed to look like lotus blossoms, and so all sorts of activities that were not strictly religious in principle, but that would occur at the Wat anyway. So then it has a religious and a social existence that can't be strictly separated from one another, but it means that there are more than just religious roles for the temple in the life of the community. So she points out then that you don't get in everyday life, you don't get this strict, tidy separation between religious activities and non-religious activities, where you can say, now I'm being religious, now I'm not. Now I'm engaged in something completely non-religious, say economic or what have you. So then you don't get this strict separation. In everyday life, these things are kind of sewn into one another. And religious practice is, for the most part, partly about making merit, partly about cultivating Jayen. Why does this matter? Well, so the merit-making part of it, you could see as a straightforwardly religious activity. Cultivating Jayen, though, is not necessarily or not principally about achieving some religious goal. That's mostly social in nature. That's mostly about being able to get along with other people in the expected way. So then you go and participate in religious practices as a way of cultivating something that will make you a good member of your community. Second chapter, heat. So we've gone from cool heart now to heat. This opens this chapter with a common fieldwork conundrum. The problem as an anthropologist of not knowing and not fitting in, being the odd person out, but in particular of not knowing unspoken rules and therefore not being able to follow those rules, breaking them, in short. Engaging in transgressions that you don't even know are transgressions. But there's a silver lining to this. Disruption of social expectations reveals those expectations to you. They become visible in this way. This is how you get to learn the rules that you didn't even know existed. And by learning them then, you can start to attune yourself to these implicit rules. And this is why one of the individuals, I can't remember who it was right now, comments at one point that Cassaniti is becoming more Thai. And what does she mean by this? She doesn't mean simply that her command of the language has improved, though surely that's the case. She means that her ability to follow implicit rules, finding her feet with people, has improved so greatly that in a way, like, she doesn't need to be coached through simple things like how to walk around inside a home. This is something as well when I first went to Thailand on a youth exchange, so not for field work, when I was much younger, that we all had to learn. All of us Canadians who were on this exchange also had to learn this, that because most Thai households are built elevated. They have to compensate for floods, for example. So they're mostly elevated, and so you're always walking around on sort of a second level. Usually it was a wood floor, very often teak, so very, very hard wood, but still wood. And so if you clomped around, you were making a lot of noise. You're making a racket. And that would bother the people who were underneath if they were doing things underneath. But it would also create a racket for people who were on that same level of the household. So you had to learn how to walk. And that's a strange thing to have to learn how to do. It's this unconscious, habitual activity that doesn't seem to require any learning. And yet, there's a way that it too is culturally informed, so that you need to learn how to place your foot so that you're not thumping around. This is the same kind of thing then that is an unspoken rule, but that she needs to be coached through. Why? Because she discovers that she's breaking this implicit rule, implicit value, implicit guideline, call it what you will. But by breaking it, discovering that she's breaking it, she's able to change it. And by changing it, and therefore changing her behavioral habits, her body habits, how she moves, how she interacts with people, she becomes more Thai. Again, to borrow from Geertz, who borrows from Wittgenstein, this is how she finds her feet with them. So then in this case, she learned the importance of managing her affect, her expressiveness, rather than her behavior. This is how she becomes more Jayen, by becoming more sort of impassive about things. And so she cites examples in which the expectation is not that she's going to do the things that she is being asked to do, but that she will receive the invitation to do these things in a particular way, with a certain kind of Jayen grace, that she'll smile and be accommodating in her response to the request, even if it's something that she doesn't feel that she can fulfill. Now, as an example, that is not exactly on par, but is close to what she is describing here. When I was younger and I was in Bangkok with a friend, and we were trying to get around the city, sort of a game that we would have with ourselves is we'd just get on a random bus, whatever bus, and then we'd get off somewhere and just sort of see what was there, wander around. And then eventually, of course, we would have to find our way back. And so we would ask people how to get from where we were to wherever. And we would get directions. And reliably, the directions would be completely made up. The people who we were asking had no idea where this place was that we were trying to get. But the important thing was not that they give us accurate directions, but that they give us a response with a certain kind of affect. And initially this was befuddling for us, but sort of once we came to recognize that that's how things were done, it was fine. Then we could make the necessary adjustments so that we could get where we needed to go. But it's in keeping with this idea that Cassaniti is outlining, that what's important is sort of the way in which you respond to the person's request, rather than the behavior that you're offering down the road, but that might not actually work out in practice. In this way, then, she also starts to see more clearly how people's, as it were, natural reactions and expressions are deeply conditioned by acculturation. So that, in other words, the way that we spontaneously react to something, like without having to consider how we're going to react, without planning our response, the way that we spontaneously react is, as she's pointing out, culturally conditioned. It's not something that is, as it were, innate to us, that all people in all places at all times are going to react in the same way to this thing, but rather that through our acculturation as children, or if we become acculturated as adults, we will respond according to the ways that we have been acculturated. To be sure, some aspect of that is just going to be our built-in responses, that that we're going to respond with fear to things that we find frightening. How we express that might be filtered through this kind of acculturation. Yes, this is the point that she wants to get to then, is that our spontaneous responses will be deeply conditioned by acculturation. Now, to test the relationship between religion and cultural conditioning, so this very kind of acculturation that she's talking about, this conditioning of expressiveness, she went to a nearby village that was predominantly Christian, so that she could compare a Buddhist village and a Christian village that are near one another. They're in the same region. She learns a few important things there. So first, the cultivated expressionlessness or impassivity of Jiayan in Mejiang is not as evident, not as on display as in the more expressive community of Ban Kotao. She does note here, though, that there are other, so she's not able to control for all other factors and keep religion as the only variable, right? Because there are other things. There are linguistic differences, for example, because this is an ethnically Karen community. So that can play a role. What role? Well, we don't exactly know because we can't simply disentangle religion from ethnicity and linguistic community in any nice, tidy way where we can see what the contribution of each is. Still, she wants to maintain the possibility that religious affiliation will have something to do with acculturation into expressiveness. And if you accept that religion and acculturation or socialization are going to have something to do with one another, that they're not strictly separate from one another, then that's not a crazy thing to think, really. So then second, when this representative of an evangelical sort of fire and brimstone church from Kansas arrives and gives a talk to the congregation in this Baptist, I believe, community, being very animated, very stern about, how we have to, well, you have to go and you have to convert those people down the hill in Mejiang to Christianity, and gets all very fire and brimstone-y about it all. She discovers that the pastor actually does not feel compelled to translate all of that for the congregation, for the Karen congregation. So then, even within a particular religion, co-religionists, they're not necessarily going to have an immediate affinity on all things. Why? Because these people down in Mejiang, these are their neighbors, these are their friends. As he says, we like those people down there, and so we don't want to treat them in this way, which is an interesting thing. I think in many American, especially evangelical congregations, there would be this feeling that if you don't try to convert the non-Christian, then you're not doing them any favors. You're not treating them nicely. The important thing is to convert them. That's what's going to secure them a place in heaven, for example. But these people in Ban Kotao, that's not how they felt. They had this affinity with their neighbors that balanced against the demands of their co-religionists. Why? Because they say all religion teaches one to be a good person. And so he was content that his neighbors down the hill, or down the road, I don't actually know if it was uphill or downhill, down the road. He's content that their religion, Buddhism, is also teaching them to be good people. And in a way, that's good enough for him. Now, interestingly enough, it turns out that that particular phrase crops up multiple times for Cassaniti. Why? Because this is a phrase from a school book that was used throughout the North and among the Karen and ethnically Thai communities in the area to discuss religion, so that the school book takes this sort of religiously neutral position to say all religions teach people to be good people, and that this is something then that has made its way into this sort of shared consciousness of religion, even across different religious divides. But it pointed to the role that religion plays all the same. Religion, according to the Ministry of Education, was about creating good people. And so the history and cultural touchstones shared by these two communities, in a way, was more important than their religious differences. So curiously enough, perhaps not curiously, seems curious to me. It's interesting. It's noteworthy that the connection between co-religionists of different linguistic and national and ethnic origins, US and Karen, is less important to the congregants and the pastor in Ban Kotao than the connection that he and his community feel with the people just down the road who just don't happen to be Christian. They happen to be Buddhist. That the things that they're sharing through their history, through their cultural points of contact, those are the things that are more important for them. So in a sense, for them, it's better to be a good neighbor than it is to convert your good neighbor through possibly pushy methods to become co-religionist with you. The differences in expressiveness between the communities, though, lead her to this conclusion that Jayen was not just a national project or universal practice, but was a religious and cultural practice. So this is interesting, right? That she's taking this idea that something that is widely practiced and just taken for granted as a natural response in Thailand, but that is not a natural response, or at least Buddhist Thailand, but that is not something that feels natural for, say, Americans. She's doing an interesting thing here and trying to debunk the idea that this is just natural. And I don't know that she's doing this intentionally or not, but there's an important lesson here anyway. And that lesson is that it's very easy to get to the field to do field work with the assumption that your natural reactions are just natural and that they're not mediated culturally. And so when people diverge from what your natural reaction would be, that needs some kind of explanation. and that's somehow not natural. So in a way, she's sort of flipping the script here in an interesting, possibly a very subtle and clever way, to say, well, no, Jian is not just a kind of inborn, intrinsically human natural response, that it is a religious and cultural response. And further, I appreciate that she's saying not simply religious, but religious and cultural, recognizing that these are two tendencies that are not identical with one another, even as they are deeply intertwined with one another. So deeply that there's probably no sense even trying to separate out what is cultural, as if that exists in this nice tidy sphere, and what is religious, as if this has its own non-cultural existence. Moving on. She detects then this deep connection between Buddhist teachings on equanimity and Jian as an embodied practice of softening one's emotions. And there's something interesting here. She doesn't put it in this way, but nonetheless, I think you could, to say that where many emotions are things that happen to you, or at least they're experienced as something happening to you, Jian is not that. Jian is a kind of achievement, so that it's something, as she does point out, that you can cultivate by going to the Wat, by meditating, by engaging in merit-making exercises, so that as something cultivated, it is something that you do, something that you achieve. Carrying on, this discovery introduced a new problem for her, and that is how to translate the English word emotion, because there's no satisfying equivalent in Thai. So again, she finds herself facing the problem of arriving in the field with assumptions about what would be there. There's a thing that we call emotion that they're going to call something, and we'll just be able to translate, and it will be nice and tidy. No, it doesn't work out like that. That, in fact, there's not a word. There are words that are often used as sort of approximate translations. Grusuk for something like feeling, arom for something like mood, but that there's something about the idea of emotion that's not quite captured by these terms, and or by any other Thai term. So then the question that she poses is, if there's no word for it in Thai, did they experience such things as emotions? Now, on the one hand, I think that there's an interesting question here, one she doesn't really delve into, about what her picture of language is, what the relationship between our language and our worlds might be. She doesn't really explore that, though, at this point, so I'll note that and then set it aside to get to the more pressing thing, this untranslatability of emotion. So the implication here, she says, emotions may not be basic, but rather are always culturally particular and contextual, having more to do with interpersonal relations than states. So that this is an interesting thing then, right? That an emotion is not about being in a particular state, but that it is interpersonal, it is relational. That should feel, for at least some of us, disturbing, because we feel like we experience emotions as individuals, as sort of atomic individuals, that what I feel is what I feel, and what you feel is something else. And I don't know what you feel. I can't tell what you feel. I can guess, but I can't know what you feel. I can only know what I feel. There's a certain problem there, too. It's not clear that we know what we feel, that it's not clear that that's the relationship that we have to our feelings or to our emotions. She's adding another layer of complexity here and saying that it may actually be that what we start off considering to be emotions, we in this case being social psychologists or anthropologists with a particularly psychological bent to their work, that they might not be these sort of atomic, individualized things, but they might be social in nature. They might be relational and interpersonal in nature. She doesn't give it much fanfare, but it's an interesting and I think very provocative and very thought-provoking sort of hypothesis to venture. So how does she capture this? In the Thai context, she considers how people in Mejang discuss this notion arom. It's probably best translated as mood, but as I say, it's a frequent stand-in for emotion. It's just not a very satisfying stand-in for emotion. It does better as mood. It's used more consistently in the way that an English speaker would use mood. So they consider, the people in Mejang consider emotionality, arom, as diffuse and inchoate moods that can potentially overtake the body and mind for more intense but always brief periods before evaporating in the air. So then, how do you study such an amorphous, ephemeral thing? How do you do that? Well, this is where the next part of the book starts off. So we leave this here with a certain level of uncertainty about how it is that we're going to think about emotion, and whether we can think of it as a thing, a state that you can simply directly study, or if it's going to take a different kind of work. It seems she's pointing toward the idea of it being a different kind of work, one that appreciates how religion intertwines with our, or their, I should say, enculturation. Thank you.